There is a nexus between science and politics. Scientific discoveries often have geopolitical implications. Governments often fund science for political and even military purposes. Sometimes science that was designed for military purposes ends up having a more purely scientific application. And sometimes science that is designed for purely scientific applications has military implications. And that all came together in a very strange, almost bizarre and dangerous way on a clear winter morning in January of 1995. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1945, Canada created the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, or CARDE. The general idea was to maintain the research infrastructure that had developed during the war, partially for the purpose of not being reliant on the United States. In 1951, CARDE began research into rocket technology, originally designing air-to-air missiles and anti-tank rockets. They continued into the development of solid rocket fuels, largely aimed at developing anti-ballistic missile systems. CARDE worked to develop a propulsion test vehicle for their rocket fuels. First introduced in 1959, the vehicle was designed to be able to accommodate a wide variety of engine burning times, propellant loadings, and launch angles, in keeping with its role as a test vehicle for anti-ballistic missile systems. The research never produced an anti-ballistic missile system, but the solid rocket fuels that were researched ended up being used in many Western missile systems. But the research took an interesting turn, as the propulsion test vehicle turned out to be a great platform for something called a sounding rocket. Sounding rockets are used for research. Their purpose is to take measurements and perform scientific experiments during suborbital flight. The term sounding rocket derives from the nautical term sounding, where a weighted line is dropped to determine water depth. Sounding rockets are valuable for a number of reasons. They carry scientific instruments to areas that are largely inaccessible to other research platforms like balloons and satellites. They are relatively inexpensive and reliable, making them a good test bed for equipment to be used for orbital spaceflight, which is more expensive and more risky. The propulsion test vehicle, originally intended for anti-ballistic missile systems, developed into one of the world's most reliable sounding rocket systems, called Black Brant. The first Black Brant 1 design could carry a 68-kilogram payload to a 150-kilometer altitude. The system developed many variants that offered different ranges and payload sizes. But what is most remarkable is the system's reliability. There have only been a couple of failures of Black Brant systems, both in a testing stage. Black Brant is simply one of the most reliable rocket systems in history, with a 98% success rate. The reliability of the Black Brant system is one reason that it is commonly used by the Canadian Space Agency and NASA. The most current versions of Black Brant use a multi-stage design and have reached altitudes of more than 1,500 kilometers, which is above the ionosphere, that is well above the orbits of the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. Sounding rockets are particularly valuable to the field of aeronomy, the meteorological science of the upper region of planetary atmospheres. Aeronomy researches the area from the mesosphere to the outer reaches of the thermosphere and all the regions of the Earth's ionosphere. Aeronomy seeks to understand phenomena of ionization, recombination, chemical reaction, photoemission, and the transport of energy and momentum within and between these regions. Aeronomy studies a number of fascinating phenomena of upper atmospheric lighting, such as sprites and blue jets. One particular area of study for the field of aeronomy is the magnetosphere, the region of space in which charged particles are manipulated or affected by the Earth's magnetic field. Of particular interest to some aeronomists is a phenomena where the magnetosphere is sufficiently disturbed by the solar wind that the trajectories of charged particles in both solar wind and magnetospheric plasma, mainly in the form of electrons and protons, precipitate into the upper atmosphere due to Earth's magnetic field, where their energy is lost, producing a light display. Essentially, the sheets of colored lights are the product of violent collisions between Earth's atmosphere and particles from the sun. The light display is known by many names, including the polar lights, the northern lights, and the southern lights, but it is most commonly known as the aurora. There are many reasons to study the aurora. As the lights of the aurora are only the end product of a complicated interaction between the sun and Earth, they represent something called space weather. Understanding space weather is important to practical fields, such as protecting satellites, radio communications, and power systems from the effects of magnetic storms. As the aurora is a plasma phenomenon, it also provides a natural laboratory for the study of plasma physics. And, according to NASA, by studying the interaction of the sun and its solar wind with Earth's upper atmosphere, scientists are also able to apply the knowledge to other planetary bodies, helping us understand these interactions throughout the universe as well. Sounding rockets like the Black Brant are excellent tools for studying the aurora, given the location where these plasma interactions occur. So it's easy to understand how Kolbjorn Adelson, the director of the Andia rocket range in Norway, was particularly excited about the launch of a Black Brant sounding rocket on January 25, 1995. There was clear weather and northern lights in 3 different places: Alaska, Svalbard, and Andia, and that does not happen every day. The use of a Black Brant 12 was particularly exciting, as it was one of the largest rockets ever fired from Andia, planning to reach over 1,500 kilometers up. Speaking to Norwegian Public Broadcasting, he recalled that the launch and photographic experiments went perfectly. It was only a few hours later, when people began to call, that he started to realize the magnitude of the disaster that he and his rocket had almost caused. Looking back, the period of the Cold War almost seems comic today. Tensions were so strained that American school children were shown a movie where a cartoon turtle named Bert taught them to duck and cover in the case that the Russians, oddly represented by a monkey with a stick of dynamite, decided to attack the U.S. with atom bombs. Cold War kids knew how to duck under a desk at a moment's notice. The tense moments of the Berlin airlift captivated the nation and the world. Proxy wars were fought around the world in places like China, Greece, the Middle East, Korea, Angola, Indochina, and Afghanistan, and the 2 great rivals spent their national treasure developing weapons to threaten each other with assured destruction. Many think of the October Crisis of 1962, commonly called the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the pinnacle of the Cold War, and the closest point that the 2 great powers came to actually pulling the nuclear trigger. Then came that extraordinary moment, November 9th of 1989, when the symbol of the Cold War, the wall that separated East and West Berlin, was torn down. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cold War had finally ended, and with its demise, the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation that had been with humanity for more than 5 decades seemed to have faded into history. The Soviet Union, under its 8th and final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, began a process of opening relations and markets. In a dramatic series of events, hardliners at the Communist Party of the Soviet Union attempted a coup against Gorbachev in August of 1991. The attempted takeover was defeated by a campaign of civil disobedience, led by the popularly elected president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. The coup attempt had the effect of weakening Gorbachev and strengthening Yeltsin. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, declared his office extinct and handed over power to Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the sovereign state of the Russian Federation. The following day, December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved under Declaration number 142-H of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin took on a conciliatory policy of foreign relations that signaled to the world that the Cold War was officially over. But it was not all as simple as it originally appeared. The economic dislocation and breakdown of ties led to a financial crisis through the entire old Soviet bloc that some have described as worse than the Great Depression. A constitutional crisis in 1993 between Parliament and the President resulted in riots in Moscow, where 197 people were killed. There were new tensions in the former Soviet bloc and the post-Soviet world, much of it having to do with realignment of some of the breakaway republics towards the West. The Russian Federation became embroiled in a bloody conflict with separatists in Chechnya in the North Caucasus, and former Soviet satellite states such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were engaging in dialogue with the West that appeared to be leading towards membership in NATO. Increasingly, the Russian government was blaming the U.S. for undermining its interests and sowing division within the former Soviet Union states. Despite the changes since 1991, the tensions and mistrust of the Cold War era between Russia and the U.S. were still alive. And into these tensions came Kolbjorn Adelson's sounding rocket. The Norwegian and U.S. scientists involved in the experiment had notified 30 countries, including Russia, of their intention to launch a high-altitude scientific experiment aboard a rocket. However, for reasons that are still not completely clear, that information had not made it to the technicians who manned Russia's missile attack warning system. Russia has argued that the warning provided was vague, but it also seems possible that the warning was lost in the bureaucracy of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Within seconds of the launch, the rocket, nearly twice as large as any ever launched before from Andoya, appeared on the screens of the missile attack warning radar in Murmansk Oblast, Russia, where the rocket's path, speed, and shape matched the Russian image of how a Western nuclear attack would begin. Since the radar could not determine exactly where the rocket launched, the Russians did not understand that it came from Andia. All they could determine was that the rocket came from somewhere outside the Norwegian coast, where American ballistic missile submarines would be positioned if their plan was to attack Russia with their Trident III missiles. The rocket was on a far northern trajectory that included an air corridor that went from the North Dakota Minuteman III silos all the way to Moscow. The high trajectory also suggested that it might be an electromagnetic pulse weapon, or EMP, a missile that's designed to explode in the atmosphere and blind Russian sensors to an all-out attack. As the rocket separated from its second stage, it looked on radar exactly as if it was a multiple reentry vehicle, or MIRV, a single missile designed to launch multiple warheads. Instantly, the entire Russian military was put on high alert. The response was especially dangerous, as Russian doctrine at the time assumed that the president had only 10 minutes from detection of a launch to authorize a retaliatory strike in time. Russian ballistic missile submarines were ordered to come to attack readiness, preparing to launch a retaliatory strike. Klaxons sounded in bunkers containing Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles as their teletype machines typed out nuclear alerts. The technicians inserted their nuclear keys. Their next command could be an attack order. President Boris Yeltsin was brought what the Russian military calls the Shagat. Developed in the 1980s, the Shagat, named after a Russian mountain peak, is a hard-shell briefcase filled with electronics, a portable terminal linked to the command and control network for Russia's strategic nuclear forces. It allows the president to monitor a missile crisis, make decisions, and transmit those decisions to the military. In America, the case is referred to as the football. In common parlance, it is the nuclear briefcase. It carried the codes and means of communication that authorized the launch of the Russian nuclear arsenal. In this case, something happened that has never been known to have happened previously or since. President Yeltsin activated his nuclear keys, meaning that the world was the press of a button away from nuclear Armageddon. Never before, not during the Cuban Missile Crisis, not during the Berlin Crisis of 1961, not during the U-2 incident in 1960, not during the proxy wars of the Cold War, had the leader of a nuclear power been known to activate the keys, readying a nuclear attack. Within 8 minutes, it was clear that the missile was headed for the ocean, not Russia. 8 of 10 minutes, putting the world, possibly, just 2 minutes shy of nuclear war. There's still a great degree of disagreement over how close Boris Yeltsin came to pressing that button. Some argue that it would have been relatively obvious that this lone rocket was not headed towards Russia, and that the early warning satellites would have made it clear that there was no larger strike on the horizon. Yeltsin himself didn't make a big deal of it. It wasn't reported in Russia for over a week, and when it was, Yeltsin simply said that they had followed the rocket to see where it would land. But former CIA analyst Peter Pry argues that this is the closest the world ever came to nuclear Armageddon. He says that the Russian Ministry of Defense was arguing to authorize the retaliatory strike, and that the Russian military had done everything necessary to launch its entire nuclear arsenal except for the press of that one button. The difference between this and better-known incidents like the Cuban Missile Crisis is that those other incidents evolved slowly over time and it gave leaders time to think. But this one was done under that intense, tight pressure of the very brief window that is necessary to authorize a retaliatory strike in time. But in the end, perhaps what's most surprising is this may be the closest the world ever came to nuclear war occurred not at the height of the Cold War, but in 1995, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, both sides have improved their notification protocols, and that might in the future prevent things like this, which has become known as the Norwegian Rocket Incident. But the whole event reminds us that the threat of nuclear war still exists. And that reminder alone is a good reason why this rocket that was built for war turned to science, and in doing so almost started a war, deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.